The cold wind blew through the small iron window of the prison cell. Inside, sitting on the hard cement floor, was a man named Thomas White. His face was pale, his eyes tired, and his hair long and messy. The prison walls were dark and wet, and the smell of dust and old sweat filled the air. Every day felt the same inside that cell. But today, something felt different. Today, Thomas remembered the moment everything in his life changed. Thomas had not always been a prisoner. Once, he was a free man, living in a small town called Riverdale. He worked as a carpenter. People in the town trusted him. They liked his smile and the way he helped others. He built chairs, tables, and even houses. He had dreams. He wanted to open his own shop one day. He wanted to marry Anna, the girl who lived across the street. But all those dreams were now gone. It all started one rainy night. Thomas was walking home from work. His clothes were wet, and his boots were heavy with mud. He heard shouting near the market. Curious, he walked toward the noise. When he reached the market, he saw a man lying on the ground, bleeding. A knife was beside him. People were screaming, running in different directions. Before Thomas could understand what was happening, someone shouted, "There he is! That's him! He killed the merchant!" Thomas froze. He looked around, confused. Then two guards grabbed him from behind. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. They dragged him to the town jail. That night, Thomas was locked up for a crime he didn't commit. And no one listened to his words. The guards said he was found near the body. The knife had his fingerprints. The town's judge, a man who had never liked Thomas, sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Just like that, his life changed. Now, sitting in the prison cell, Thomas thought of that night again and again. His heart was heavy with sadness, but also with anger. He didn't hate the people who blamed him. He hated himself for not fighting harder to prove his innocence. Every morning, a guard named Old Peter brought him bread and water. Peter was thin, with a wrinkled face and tired eyes. He never spoke much, but sometimes he looked at Thomas with pity. "You shouldn't be here, boy," Peter said one morning, placing the metal tray through the small hole in the door. Thomas looked up. "Why do you say that?" Peter paused. Then he shook his head. "I've seen real killers. You're not one of them." Those words stayed in Thomas's mind all day. He thought about them as he watched the shadows of the prison bars dance on the floor. Maybe, just maybe, someone believed him. As weeks passed, Thomas began to watch Peter more closely. He noticed that Peter's hands shook when he brought the food. His steps were slow. His voice was weaker. Maybe the old man had a secret, Thomas thought. Maybe he knew something about that night. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange, Thomas decided to speak. "Peter," he said quietly, "do you know who really killed the merchant?" Peter froze. He didn't turn around. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice so low that Thomas could barely hear it, Peter said, "Some truths are dangerous." After that, Peter walked away. Thomas sat in the darkness, thinking. His heart beat faster. Peter knew something, but why was he silent? Days turned into weeks. Every day, Thomas asked Peter questions. Every day, Peter ignored him. But one night, Peter didn't come. Instead, a young guard with a hard face brought the food. Thomas asked about Peter, but the guard said nothing. Worry filled Thomas's chest. Was Peter sick? Or worse? The next morning, Thomas heard voices outside his cell. Two guards were speaking. "Did you hear? Old Peter collapsed last night. Is he dead?" "Not yet, but he won't last long." Thomas's body felt weak. His only hope, the only man who knew something, was dying. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He paced inside his small cell, his mind racing. If Peter died, the truth would die with him. He had to do something. But what? He was a prisoner. His hands were chained. His door was locked. His window too small to escape through. Then, an idea came. It was dangerous. Maybe foolish. But it was the only chance. The next morning, when the young guard came with his food, Thomas acted. He pretended to fall, hitting his head on the floor. He lay still, his breathing slow. The guard, thinking Thomas was hurt, opened the door and stepped inside. That was Thomas's moment. Using all his strength, Thomas kicked the guard's legs, making him fall. He grabbed the keys from the guard's belt. His heart raced as he locked the guard inside the cell. Thomas was free, at least from that small cell. But he wasn't safe yet. He ran through the stone halls of the prison, looking for the infirmary where Peter might be. His bare feet slapped against the cold floor. His breath came in gasps. Any guard who saw him would raise the alarm. He had minutes, maybe seconds. Finally, he saw a small wooden door with a red cross painted on it. He pushed it open. Inside, lying on a bed, was Peter. His face was pale, his eyes half closed. "Peter," Thomas whispered, rushing to his side. Peter opened his eyes weakly. What are you doing here? Please, tell me the truth. Who killed the merchant?" Thomas begged, tears in his eyes. Peter looked at him for a long time. Then, with his last strength, he whispered a name. Thomas's heart stopped. It was someone he knew. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Guards were coming. Peter closed his eyes. His breathing stopped. Thomas stood up. He looked at Peter one last time. Then he ran. His heart was filled with two things: fear and a new hope. He now had the name of the real killer. But would he live long enough to tell anyone? Thomas ran as fast as his tired legs could carry him. The cold stone floors of the prison cut his bare feet, but he didn't stop. Peter's last words echoed in his head like a hammer. That name he never expected. Someone from his past. Someone he trusted. But now, Thomas knew the truth. Behind him, shouts filled the air. Guards were chasing him. Their boots pounded like thunder. He turned left, then right, through narrow prison hallways, searching for a way out. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from fear, but from anger. He needed to escape. He needed to tell the world who really killed the merchant. Suddenly, he reached a dead end. A heavy wooden door blocked his way. He pulled at the handle. Locked. Footsteps grew louder behind him. He looked around in panic. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Then, without thinking, Thomas picked up a heavy iron rod lying beside the door. When the first guard turned the corner, Thomas swung the rod hard. The guard fell with a cry. Another came. Thomas fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. His body was weak, but his mind was strong. He pushed, kicked, and hit until both guards lay unconscious. Breathing hard, he searched the guards' belts and found a large iron key. He rushed to the door, unlocked it, and slipped through. The door led to a small courtyard inside the prison walls. The sky above was dark with thick clouds. Rain had started to fall. Across the courtyard, Thomas saw another door. Maybe it led to freedom. But as he ran toward it, more guards appeared at the far end. They saw him. They blew their horns. The loud sound filled the night air. Thomas pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his body. He reached the door, slammed it open, and found himself in the outer storage room of the prison. Boxes of old supplies and ropes were piled everywhere. There he grabbed a long rope. He had a plan. He remembered something from his carpentry days. A strong knot. A quick climb. He threw the rope up toward a beam above the outer wall. After 2 tries, it caught. He pulled hard. It held. The guards were getting closer. Without wasting a second, Thomas climbed. His fingers bled as the rough rope burned his skin. His arms shook. But he kept going. At the top, he saw the outside world for the first time in years. Beyond the wall was a thick forest. Freedom. But just as he was about to swing over the wall, a guard's arrow flew past his ear. He felt the wind of it. Another arrow hit the beam above him. He was running out of time. Thomas took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, then pushed himself over the wall. He fell hard on the ground outside. His body hit rocks and mud. But he stood up, his legs shaking. The forest was dark and thick, but it welcomed him like an old friend. He disappeared into the trees. Behind him, the prison horn kept blowing. But Thomas was free. At least. For now, rain poured down harder as Thomas ran through the woods. The cold water washed the blood from his hands and the dirt from his face. His whole body hurt. His mind felt dizzy. But he kept moving. He needed to reach Riverdale. He needed to find the real killer. Peter's last words rang again in his mind. James Carter. Thomas couldn't believe it. James had been his friend. They had worked together, drank together, laughed together. Why? Why would James frame him for murder? Thomas remembered James had always been jealous of his skills. Maybe that jealousy had turned into something darker. Maybe James wanted to remove Thomas from his path. But could a man really destroy another man's life like that? Thomas didn't have the answers, but he would soon. After hours of running, Thomas reached the edge of the forest. In the distance, he saw the small lights of Riverdale. His home, his nightmare. His plan was simple. Find James. Make him confess. No matter what. But first, he needed shelter. He couldn't walk into town in prison clothes, covered in mud and blood. Thomas remembered old Mary. She lived alone in a small house near the river. She had known Thomas since he was a boy. If anyone would help him, it was her. He moved carefully, avoiding the main road. He stayed hidden in shadows. Every sound made him jump. He knew the guards had sent word to Riverdale. The people were told to look for him. His face would be in their minds. His name cursed by their lips. Finally, near midnight, Thomas reached old Mary's house. It was a small wooden cottage, warm light glowing from inside. He knocked softly. Nothing. He knocked again. A little harder. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Then the door opened a little. An old woman peeked out. At first. She said nothing. Then she whispered, "Thomas White?" Tears filled Thomas's eyes. He nodded. Before he could speak, old Mary opened the door fully and pulled him inside. "You fool boy. What are you doing here? They'll kill you if they find you." Thomas collapsed on her floor. His strength was gone. His body could take no more. Old Mary dragged him to a small bed, covered him in warm blankets, and fed him spoonfuls of soup. She washed his wounds, her old hands shaking. When Thomas could finally speak, he whispered, "Peter told me. It was James. James Carter killed the merchant." Old Mary's face went white. "Oh my boy," she said softly. "You knew?" Thomas asked, weakly. Old Mary sat beside him, silent for a long time. "I always suspected, but no one would listen. James has money now, friends and power. People fear him." Thomas felt his anger rise. James had everything now. His shop, his dream, his life. "I must make him confess," Thomas said. Old Mary shook her head. "You'll die before you reach him." But Thomas's eyes burned with determination. "Then I'll die trying." Outside, the rain slowed. But in Thomas's heart, the storm was only beginning. He knew his next step. He would face James Carter, and this time, he would not lose. Morning came slowly. Thin sunlight crept through the cracks in old Mary's wooden cottage. Thomas opened his eyes. His body ached, but his mind was sharp. He had one purpose now: find James Carter and make him confess. He sat up, ignoring the pain. He couldn't afford to waste time. Old Mary entered the small room with a bowl of warm porridge. "You need to eat, Thomas," she said softly. "I don't have time, Mary," Thomas replied. "You can't fight on an empty stomach." He hesitated, then took the bowl. He ate quickly, knowing she was right. Every second counted. "Listen to me, boy," old Mary said, sitting beside him. "James Carter is not the same man you once knew. He's powerful now. He owns the biggest workshop in Riverdale. People respect him. Some fear him. He has guards, friends in the council. If you go to him alone, he'll kill you before you open your mouth." Thomas looked down at his shaking hands. "Then what should I do?" Old Mary thought for a moment. Then her old eyes lit up. "There's someone who might help. Robert Dale. He's a councilman now, but he was your father's friend. He's an honest man, Thomas. If anyone will listen to you, it's him." Thomas nodded. A spark of hope flickered in his heart. He stood up slowly. Old Mary handed him clean clothes, an old shirt and trousers from her late husband. They were a bit loose, but far better than his dirty prison rags. She also gave him a worn-out cloak to help hide his face. "I'll go tonight," Thomas said, "when darkness hides me." But that day, Thomas stayed hidden in Mary's cottage, resting and gathering his strength. As he lay in the small bed, he thought about James Carter. He remembered their childhood. They were once like brothers. How could James have betrayed him? What had he done to deserve such hate? By evening, Thomas was ready. Old Mary gave him a small knife. "For protection," she said softly. Thomas didn't want to hurt anyone, but he knew he might not have a choice. When night fell, Thomas slipped out of the cottage. his heart racing. He kept to the shadows, moving carefully through the back alleys of Riverdale. Every corner could hide a guard. Every window could hold someone watching. At last, he reached Robert Dale's house. It was large but simple, made of stone and wood. A lantern burned outside the door. Thomas knocked softly. A few moments later, the door opened. Robert Dale stood there holding a candle. His hair was gray now, but his eyes were sharp. Who? Then Robert recognized him. Thomas White. He whispered, "Please, sir, let me explain." Without a word, Robert pulled him inside and closed the door. In the safety of Robert's study, Thomas told him everything: the night of the merchant's murder, Peter's last words, and James Carter's betrayal. He spoke with desperation, fear, and anger. Robert listened carefully, his face unreadable. When Thomas finished, silence filled the room. Robert stood up and poured himself a glass of water. He drank slowly, thinking, "I always wondered why you never fought harder in court," Robert said finally. "But now I understand. They never gave you a chance. Do you believe me?" Thomas asked. Robert looked at him firmly. "Yes, I believe you." Tears stemmed Thomas's eyes. "But believing you isn't enough," Robert continued. "We need proof." "I have nothing," Thomas said weakly. "Only Peter's last words." Robert paced the room. Peter's testimony would have been enough if he were alive. But now, words of a dead man carry little weight in court. Thomas's hope began to fade. "Then I'll confront James myself," Thomas said. "I'll force him to confess, and die in the process?" Robert shook his head. "That's foolish. What choice do I have?" Robert thought for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "There's one way." Thomas leaned forward. "James Carter keeps records," Robert explained. "He writes down every deal, every payment. If he paid someone to kill the merchant, it might be written somewhere." Thomas frowned. "But how do we get those records?" Robert looked directly at him. "You break into James Carter's house." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Break into James's house? It sounded impossible. But Robert's voice was calm and serious. "He keeps his records in a locked chest in his office. If you can find it, we might find the proof you need." Thomas took a deep breath. His fear fought with his determination. He knew what he had to do. "I'll do it," Robert nodded slowly. "I'll help where I can. Tomorrow night, I'll distract James. There's a council meeting he must attend. You'll have a small window, I understand." Robert looked at Thomas, concern in his eyes. "If you're caught, you'll hang." Thomas stood. His eyes were steady. "I'm already dead if I do nothing." Robert clasped his shoulder. "Then may luck be with you, Thomas White." That night, Thomas returned to old Mary's cottage. He told her the plan. Her face turned pale with fear. "You're mad," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. "I have no choice." Old Mary didn't argue. She simply kissed his forehead like she did when he was a child. "I'll pray for you," she said softly. The next day passed slowly. Thomas stayed hidden, his mind racing. He practiced in his mind how he would move through James's house, where he would look, how he would escape. When darkness finally fell, Robert came for him. "This is your chance," Robert said quietly. "James is at the council hall. His guards will be fewer tonight." Together, they moved through the silent streets. When they reached James Carter's house, Thomas's heart pounded. The house was grand, built of stone and iron. Windows were dark. Guards stood at the front, but Robert had arranged a distraction. Two of his men lured the guards away, pretending to start a drunken fight nearby. Thomas slipped to the side of the house, where an old servant's door stood. Robert had left it unlocked. This was it. With one deep breath, Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside. Silence. Inside the house, the air smelled of polished wood and oil lamps. Thomas moved carefully through the hallways. Every creak of the floor made him freeze. Finally, he found James's office. A heavy oak door. Locked, Thomas pulled out the small knife old Mary gave him. Using skills he learned as a carpenter, he worked on the lock. His hands shook. Sweat dripped from his brow. The door opened. Thomas slipped inside. The office was large and dark, lit only by the moonlight through the window. A heavy desk sat in the middle. Shelves of books lined the walls, and there, beside the desk, was the chest. Thomas rushed to it. Locked. He picked the lock as quickly as he could. His mind screamed that time was running out. Any second, James or a guard could return. The chest opened. Inside were piles of papers, books and ledgers. Thomas dug through them, searching for anything that could help. Then he saw it. A letter.it was written in James's handwriting, a payment to a man named Grayson. A payment made the night before the merchant's death, paid to silence a witness. Thomas's hands trembled. This was it. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside the office. Someone was coming. Thomas grabbed the letter, stuffed it inside his shirt, and closed the chest. He moved toward the window. It was his only way out. The door creaked open. Thomas threw himself out the window just as James Carter stepped into the office. Shouts rang out behind him as Thomas hit the ground and ran into the darkness. He had the proof. Now, the real fight would begin. Thomas ran into the night, his heart pounding like a drum. Behind him, James Carter's angry voice roared from the broken window. "Catch him! Catch that thief!" Guards poured out from the front of the house, their shouts slicing through the silence of Riverdale. Thomas didn't look back. He couldn't. He clutched a stolen letter tightly against his chest, knowing it was his only hope of clearing his name. His only proof that James Carter was the real criminal. His feet hit the wet ground hard as he raced through the dark streets. He knew every corner, every alley, every broken fence. This was the town where he had grown up. Now, it felt like a trap behind him. Boots thundered, dogs barked. He turned left, then right, slipping into the shadows. But he knew the guards were closing in. His legs burned. His breath came in sharp gasps. His vision blurred from exhaustion. Suddenly, ahead of him, two guards appeared. There he is. Thomas turned sharply down another alley. He slipped in the mud, almost falling. His body screamed at him to stop, to rest. But he forced himself to keep moving. Then he saw a door, an old barn, abandoned. He remembered it from his childhood. He threw himself against the wooden door. It creaked open. He slipped inside just as the guards ran past. Darkness surrounded him. His chest heaved. His whole body shook. He pressed himself against the wall, listening to the guards' footsteps fade into the distance. For now, he was safe. He waited for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. When the night grew quiet again, Thomas carefully stepped back outside. The town was silent once more, though fear hung in the air like smoke. Slowly, carefully, he made his way back to old Mary's cottage. When she opened the door and saw him, covered in mud, shaking from exhaustion, her old face crumpled in worry. "Oh, child, what have they done to you now?" Thomas didn't speak. He simply pulled the letter from his shirt and handed it to her. Old Mary's hands shook as she read it. "This proves James paid someone to silence a witness?" she whispered. Thomas nodded, too tired to speak. "We need Robert," Old Mary said urgently. Now, Robert Dale arrived at the cottage before dawn, dressed in a heavy cloak, his face pale with worry. "You found something?" he asked as soon as he saw Thomas. Old Mary handed him the letter. Robert read it in silence, his expression darkening. This could work. This could be enough." Thomas leaned forward. "Will they believe it?" Robert hesitated. "It's James's handwriting, his signature, but he'll deny it. He'll say you forged it. We need a witness, someone with power." Thomas's heart sank. "Who?" "The Lord Judge," Robert said. "If he sees this letter, he can order an investigation. But James has him in his pocket." Thomas shook his head, frustration boiling inside him. "Then it's useless." "No," Robert said slowly. "There's one chance." "What is it?" "There's a council meeting today at the town hall. James will be there. So will the Lord Judge. If we can present the letter publicly, before all the council members, James won't be able to silence the truth." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Stand before the council? As an escaped prisoner?" Robert looked at him firmly. "It's the only way." Old Mary's voice trembled. "They'll hang him before he says a word." "Not if I'm standing beside him," Robert replied. Silence filled the small cottage. Finally, Thomas nodded. "I'll do it." Robert gripped his shoulder. "You're braver than most." At sunrise, Robert left to prepare. He promised to meet Thomas outside the town hall when the time was right. Thomas spent those last hours with old Mary. She tied a clean cloth around his bruised hands. She whispered prayers over him. Then, as the morning bells rang from the church, she looked into his eyes. No matter what happens today, I'm proud of you. Thomas hugged her tightly. Then, he stepped outside, knowing this day could be his last. The town square was busy when Thomas arrived. People gathered near the town hall, curious about the extra guards, the whispers of danger. No one recognized Thomas beneath his cloak, but he kept his head down, his heart heavy. Robert met him near the steps. Are you ready? Thomas nodded silently. Robert led him through a side entrance, past guards who trusted the councilman enough not to ask questions. Inside, the grand hall was filled with council members, local leaders, and townspeople. At the front, sitting like a king on his throne, was the Lord Judge, and beside him stood James Carter. Thomas felt his stomach twist. James looked confident, dressed in rich clothes, laughing softly as he spoke to the judge. He had no idea what was coming. Robert leaned close to Thomas and whispered, "Follow my lead." The council meeting began. Robert stood to speak. His voice echoed through the hall. "My lords, my friends and I come today with grave news. A crime has been hidden in this town, and today we will expose it." Murmurs filled the hall. James frowned. The Lord Judge narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about, Robert Dale?" Robert turned and motioned. Thomas stepped forward. Gasps echoed through the hall. "That's Thomas White!" Someone shouted. "He escaped prison. Catch him!" The guards moved, but Robert raised his hand. "Stop! This man brings proof of his innocence." The hall froze. Thomas's legs shook as he stood beside Robert, facing the Lord Judge, the council, and James Carter. He pulled the letter from his cloak and held it up. "This letter," Robert announced, "written and signed by James Carter himself, proves he paid a man to silence a witness to the merchant's murder. It proves Thomas White was framed." The hall exploded with noise. "No, lies!" James roared, stepping forward, his face red with anger. "That letter is a trick, a forgery." The Lord Judge stood slowly. "Let me see it." Robert handed him the letter. Silence filled the hall as the Lord Judge read. His expression darkened. James Carter's confidence cracked. He shouted wildly, "That means nothing. He stole that." But then, someone else stood, an old man. Thin, frail, old Peter. Alive. The hall gasped again. Peter's voice was weak but clear. "I heard James Carter give the order that night. I stayed silent, but no longer." James's face turned to horror. You're dead." I should have spoken long ago," Peter said softly. The Lord Judge turned toward James, fury in his eyes. "Seize him." Guards rushed forward, grabbing James as he screamed and fought. Thomas felt his knees buckle. Robert caught him. "It's over," Robert whispered. Tears streamed down Thomas's face. It was over. The truth had won. The real killer was unmasked, and the prisoner was finally free. The sun rose high over Riverdale as James Carter sat locked inside the same prison where Thomas White had once suffered. His name, once respected, was now cursed. People whispered about his crimes in every corner of the town. His friends turned their backs. His power was gone. But Thomas stood in the town square, no longer a prisoner. He stood quietly beside Robert Dale, watching as people gathered around. Some whispered, others watched silently. Old Mary stood close, tears shining in her eyes. Peter sat nearby, weak but alive, his old face calm. The Lord Judge himself had spoken the words Thomas had dreamed of hearing for years. "You, Thomas White, are free, and your name is cleared." Yet Thomas didn't smile. He felt strange inside. The chains on his body were gone, but chains still weighed down his heart. Years stolen, dreams lost, people who had turned away. He didn't feel like celebrating. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did what few men could. You fought for the truth." Thomas looked at him, tired. "And what now?" "Now, you live." But living felt harder than he thought. For days after James's arrest, Thomas walked through the streets of Riverdale like a ghost. People stared. Some tried to speak to him. Some apologized. But Thomas didn't know what to say in return. He had spent too long behind cold prison walls. The world felt too big, too loud. He returned to his old house. It was broken, dusty, abandoned. James Carter had taken over his workshop, his land, his life. And now, Thomas had nothing. One evening, as he sat outside his ruined house, old Mary came and sat beside him. She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "Why do you look more like a prisoner now than when you were chains?" Thomas didn't answer. She continued, "You've let James steal your soul. Don't let him." Thomas looked at her confused. "You think freedom is just walking outside prison walls?" She said, "No, child. Freedom is inside you. It's choosing to start again." "How can I?" Thomas whispered. "Start small. Build something." Thomas looked at his empty hands. "Build what?" Old Mary smiled gently. "Whatever your heart remembers." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stared at the wooden beams of his broken house. He thought of his father, of the workshop where he once crafted chairs and tables, of Anna, the girl whose smile once gave him hope. At dawn, Thomas made a choice. He would build again. Not for others. For himself. He cleared the dust from his workshop. He repaired broken shelves. He sharpened old tools. His hands, though scarred and weak, remembered the work. Day by day, Thomas found a new rhythm. Cutting, shaping, sanding, polishing. People in the town watched from a distance. Slowly, carefully, a few came closer. "Could you fix my chair? Can you make a table for the inn?" At first, Thomas hesitated. Then he nodded and worked with every chair, every table, every door he repaired. Thomas felt lighter. The heavy chains inside him loosened. One morning, as he opened his workshop, he found Anna standing there. He froze. Years had passed, but her gentle face hadn't changed. She smiled softly. "I heard you were back." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "For what?" "For leaving." "You didn't leave, Thomas," Anna said. "They took you." They stood in silence for a long time. Then Anna spoke, her voice calm and kind. "I never stopped believing in you." Tears burned Thomas's eyes. He couldn't speak. Anna reached out and took his hand. "Let's walk." Together, they walked through the streets of Riverdale. Not as a prisoner. Not as a man carrying the weight of the past, but as a man learning how to live again. Months passed. Thomas's workshop grew busier. People spoke his name with respect, not fear. Children watched him work and asked questions. Some wanted to learn. He taught them. Old Mary visited often, sitting nearby, watching him shape wood into life. Peter passed away that winter. Before he closed his eyes for the last time, he smiled at Thomas. "You're free now," he whispered. The town held a proper burial for him. Thomas stood beside Robert Dale at the grave, grateful to the old man who had helped free him. As spring arrived, Thomas stood outside his workshop one morning, looking at the sunrise. Anna stood beside him, her hand in his. He breathed deeply. The air was fresh. The world was new. Thomas White, once the prisoner, was now a free man in every way. And this time, no one could take his life from him. He had reclaimed it with his own hands. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.